So, you want to play Triumph of the Tusk. Hello and welcome back to Podfinder. My name is Philip, and I'm here to talk about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Today's video is another video player's guide, this time focusing on one of Paizo's newer APs, the Orc-themed Triumph of the Tusk. For those unfamiliar with my player's guides, this video will provide a brief overview of the structure and themes of the campaign while remaining light on spoilers. I'll provide a rundown of the setting and the lore leading up to the campaign, then dig into some mechanical options players can select to have a thematic connection to the story, including ancestries, classes, and religious options. I'll also be adding a little GM advice at the end, since the AP as written needs a little bit of tinkering before it can be run seamlessly. Before I go any further, I should also lay out my sources for this video. If you're planning to play in Triumph of the Tusk, you or your GM will need access to all 3 books in the AP, alongside the official player's guide which Paizo has published for free online. The Lost Omens World Guide provides some basic information on the Holds of Belkzen as a setting, while Lost Omens Legends provides a good look at Ardax the Whitehair, an important NPC in this campaign. If a GM wants to go even more in depth, they might consider reviewing the 1E sourcebook Belkzen Hold of the Orc Hordes. It's a little bit out of date, but it provides a lot of information on Belkzen as it existed prior to the rise of Ardax. With that out of the way, let's start with the campaign outline. Triumph of the Tusk is a 3-part adventure path, taking player characters from level 3 to level 12. This is the 18th adventure path which Paizo has released for 2nd edition, assuming you count the re-release of Kingmaker, and it covers books 207, 208, and 209 in the Adventure Path product line. As usual, the official player's guide for this campaign has been published online for free by Paizo, and is available at the link in the video description. Triumph of the Tusk takes place entirely in or around the Hold of Belkzen, an arid region in northern Avestan which is the home of the Orcs. First and foremost, Triumph of the Tusk is the Orc campaign. Paizo has recently been publishing APs which have focused on individual ancestries within the Inner Sea region, including Sky King's Tomb for the Dwarves and Spore War for the Elves. Following in that tradition, this AP is a significant chapter in the story of the Orcs of Avestan. It focuses on a period of transition for Orcish culture, as the clever warlord Ardax the Whitehair attempts to rally his people against a hated enemy, and usher in a new age of Orcish prosperity through merchant trade and military alliances. At a high level, Triumph of the Tusk focuses on a few recurring themes during its run. First and foremost is the theme of exploring the depth and nuance of Orcish history and culture. Orcs are typically seen as little more than raiders and savages by their neighbors, and this has even been true of some of their use in Paizo publications. This AP attempts to rectify that by exposing players and player characters to the impressive richness of Orc culture. This connects with the next major theme of negotiation and diplomacy. The inciting incident of this AP is the Torrent Moot, a gathering of disparate forces from around the Eye of Dread region with the goal of building alliances and negotiating trade agreements. The ultimate goal is to unify against the shared threat presented by the mighty necromancer Tar-Baphon. The tension between this emphasis on diplomacy and negotiation, and the perceived violent tendencies of the Orcs as a people, is key to the experience of this AP. Another theme which recurs throughout this story is the idea of survival in a harsh environment. Belkzen is a dangerous land filled with myriad threats, and understanding this is key to understanding the Orcs. All of these themes come together to put a strong emphasis on non-combat challenges, and the employment of non-violent solutions throughout the AP, which, at a glance, might seem like a straightforward murder fest. So, digging a little deeper, what exactly are we doing here? Triumph of the Tusk tells the story of Ardax the Whitehair's attempts to cultivate alliances from all around the Eye of Dread region. The Whispering Tyrant, Tar-Baphon, the most dangerous necromancer in the history of Golarion, has recently escaped captivity and is re-establishing his power base on the Isle of Terror. The Tyrant once dominated the Orcs of Belkzen during his first rise to power, and is determined to do so again. In the face of this threat, the warlord Ardax the Whitehair has put out the call to the other nations which border the Tyrant's territory. Ardax recognizes that Tar-Baphon is too powerful for Belkzen to resist alone, and the Orcs will need allies if they intend to resist the Tyrant's will. Responding to this call are the PCs, who are among the representatives sent on behalf of various interests from in and around Belkzen. Each PC represents a patron, a faction which is interested in Ardax's proposal. The PCs are seen as capable representatives, but are also seen as mostly expendable. No one trusts the Orcs, and many fear that representatives sent to Belkzen might never return. With this in mind, players should understand that the goals of the campaign are twofold. First, the PCs should want to open up diplomatic relations with the Orcs of Belkzen. Second, the PCs should be motivated to ensure that, above all, the Orcs of Belkzen do not fall under the control of the Whispering Tyrant. For more information on why that would be such a bad thing, check out my deep dive into the history of Tar-Baphon. With that broad understanding, let's get a bit more specific. Where do we start? The PCs of Triumph of the Tusk have been sent to the Torrent Moot, a meeting which serves as a sort of diplomatic kickoff between Ardax and his potential allies. The Torrent Moot is tied to an annual tradition among the Orcs of Belkzen, relating to the region's unique agricultural practices. Belkzen is a remarkably harsh environment, and very little of the land is suitable for farming or grazing due to low rainfall. The most reliable source of food in the region are the Orcs, large bovines which live in herds high up in the mountains. Every spring, powerful rainstorms unleash torrential downpours into the region, and the resulting floodwaters saturate the soil of Belkzen. This saturation leads to a sudden surge in the growth of Belkzen's normally stunted plant life. The normally arid plains become lush and full of life, and this explosion in plant growth draws the herds of Orcs down from the mountains so they can fatten up on the lowland grasses. The Orcs of Belkzen have learned to exploit this seasonal migration, and the protection and managed harvesting of these Orcs is a largely unifying aspect of Belkzen culture. To facilitate these seasonal harvests, which consist of large-scale scouting, tracking, and hunting operations, as well as the protection of the herds from outside threats, the Orcs of Belkzen created the Flood Truce. The Flood Truce is a period of peace between the Holds of Belkzen, lasting from late spring to early summer. This truce presents a unique opportunity among the Orcs, as it is a time of guaranteed peace even among enemy holds. This results in trade and negotiations between all of Belkzen's Orcs, or nearly all. In that spirit, Ardax has chosen to hold the Torrent Moot, an international negotiation held immediately before the first floodwaters rush down into the lowlands. The Torrent Moot is being held at a campsite overlooking the lowlands on the eastern side of south-central Belkzen. This site will allow for an excellent view of the flooding, which is set to begin within a few days of the PCs arriving at the moot. Ardax has invited many parties from the nations around Belkzen, merchant groups from Druma and the northern Kelid tribes, various formal militaries, including the Knights of Lastwall and the Hobgoblins of Oprak, dignitaries from multiple Orc holds, and even the Pathfinder Society. I will dig into these attendees in a bit later on, when discussing potential patrons who sponsor the PC's attendance at the Torrent Moot. PCs heading into the Torrent Moot should expect to take part in various activities as part of the conference. Contests and challenges with roots in Orcish culture are a normal pastime at this event, as may be displays of hunting or harvesting techniques. Additionally, most of the attendees will be interested in getting to know the PCs, to better understand who they might be working with during negotiations with Ardax. Now that we have an understanding of what we're trying to do and where we're starting, let's zoom back out and examine the challenges which PCs will face throughout the campaign. Triumph of the Tusk features many challenges which utilize the victory point system, or one of its variants. These challenges tend to be longer term and somewhat open-ended, with a broad goal like get to this location or get access to this secured fort. The PCs will have multiple actions they can take to accomplish these goals, with successful actions earning victory points to measure the PC's progress toward their ultimate goal. Once enough victory points are achieved, the PCs are considered to have achieved said goal. The smaller challenges which award victory points can take many forms, from single checks to combat. One example of these victory point systems is the chase system, which players and GMs should take a moment to review. Players should also understand the rules for social influence, as this is one mechanic through which the theme of negotiation and diplomacy will manifest throughout the campaign. These victory point challenges are prevalent throughout the campaign, to the point that players who don't enjoy them might find this AP to be a poor fit for their playstyle. Players and GMs should regularly check in with one another to confirm that the system is still providing a fun gameplay experience, and adjust or tweak the implementation as necessary. Looking at smaller scale challenges, when the PCs are engaging in combat, they should expect to face no small number of undead, as the threat of Tar-Baphon haunts much of this campaign. Additionally, many combat challenges will, unsurprisingly, feature orcs. Though Ardax is attempting to unify the Orcs of Belkzen and bring them into a new era of cooperation, plenty of the Orcs of the Hold are opposed to his actions. While many combats in this campaign are conventional hit-it-till-it-dies fights, there are more than a few fights which feature a twist or two, things like the need to remain quiet, or the need to end a fight quickly. Outside of combat, a number of skills will be relevant throughout the entirety of this campaign. I mentioned earlier that the theme of survival in a harsh environment is one of the pillars of the story, and characters who can effectively wield nature and survival will be able to engage effectively with this theme. Given the emphasis I've already placed on the theme of negotiation and diplomacy, it shouldn't be surprising to hear that all the social skills will be important, though perform will be the least relevant by quite a bit. Diplomacy is the king of the social skills in this campaign, though the Orcish emphasis on strength also lends extra importance to intimidation. Looking at the lore skills, obviously a wide variety of lore skills could be important at various points throughout the story. That said, Belkzen lore, Orc Pantheon lore, scouting lore, and warfare lore are all repeatedly referenced throughout the campaign. Characters focusing on these specific lore skills will be rewarded at multiple points throughout the campaign. Finally, society, religion, and athletics will all come in handy in Triumph of the Tusk. Society can help characters navigate the politics of the various holds of Belkzen. Religion will help with identification of undead, but also with navigating the recent developments in the Orc Pantheon. I'll get to those in detail later, but suffice it to say that the Orc gods have recently undergone a shakeup, and the consequences on Orc culture are still playing out. Lastly, athleticism is tremendously important to Orc culture, and a surprising number of opportunities will arise for the athletics skill to resolve non-combat problems. The History of the Orcs of Belkzen. The tale of the Orcs of Golarion begins not on the surface of Golarion, but beneath it. Orcs were, originally, a subterranean ancestry who made their homes in the upper levels of the Darklands. The Orcs were distant neighbors of the dwarves, who were similarly subterranean at the time. This ended with Earthfall, which caused planet-wide earthquakes, which the dwarves interpreted as the sign from Torag, the Forge Father, that the prophesied quest for sky should begin. In response, the majority of the dwarves began a mass migration to the surface of Golarion, which drove them into contact with the neighboring orcs. Contact soon became conflict, and the orcs found themselves on the receiving end of an invasion. The dwarves drove the orcs out of their underground homes, pushing them to the surface as well. To clarify, the dwarves were absolutely the aggressors here. Though both sides in this millennia-spanning conflict would go on to commit atrocities, the dwarves kicked things off with their reckless pursuit of the quest for sky. I'm breezing by the quest here, so for a more detailed look, I suggest you read or play the Sky King's Tomb adventure path. In minus 5088 AR, the Orcs emerged onto the surface, with many, who would go on to be called the Namathkar, eventually settling in the territory which would become known as the Hold of Belkzen. This was during the Age of Darkness, when the sky was still filled with ash. The Orcs wouldn't see the sun for a millennium until the end of the Age of Darkness. During this period, life on the surface was extraordinarily difficult. Crop failures were the norm, and resources among existing surface cultures were incredibly scarce, due to the collapse of the Thessalonian Empire. As a result of this hardship, many Orcs felt the need to engage in raiding and conquest to secure the resources needed for their own survival. For 1,000 years, the Namathkar Orcs existed in a world where the most reliable means of securing resources was violence, leading to a culture which developed ancestral practices surrounding these activities. At the same time, the surrounding peoples soon developed a fear and hatred for the Orcs. This vicious cycle laid the groundwork for the perception on Golarion today of Namathkar Orcs, and Orcs more broadly, being violent, savage brutes. The Namathkar Orcs had a poor relationship with all their neighbors, including the giants. The worst of these relationships, however, was with the dwarves, who emerged onto the surface soon after the Orcs. The dwarves established their mighty sky citadel of Koldukar, which would become their cultural capital, and the largest city in Avestan for centuries. Koldukar, however, was not long for this world. Under the legendary orc warlord Belkzen, the Namathkar Orcs rallied outside the walls of Koldukar. In minus 3708, Belkzen and his followers conquered the city of Koldukar, renaming it Urgir and forcing the dwarves to retreat to the Five Kings Mountains. Belkzen then formed the Hold of Belkzen, formalizing the territory which the Namathkar Orcs had historically occupied and went on to seize under his leadership. The laws of Belkzen were adopted over the land, enforcing Belkzen's own strictly hierarchical worldview and merciless views on crime and punishment. Belkzen's unified empire slowly crumbled after his death, leading to the fractured and violent political climate which would define the Hold of Belkzen for thousands of years thereafter. The next important chapter in this story begins in 3203 AR, with the rise of the Whispering Tyrant. Tar-Baphon, having returned to activity as a lich, sought to augment his undead armies with living foot soldiers. He set his eyes on the Orcs of Belkzen, and used his necromantic might to force them under his thumb. The Orcs, some willingly and some unwillingly, served on the front lines of the Shining Crusade, bearing the brunt of the damage which the Crusaders inflicted. Even in death, the Orcs weren't free, however, as the Whispering Tyrant would raise their corpses to fight on. With the conclusion of the Shining Crusade, and the imprisonment of Tar-Baphon, the Orcs were back under their own rulership, at least for a time. Unfortunately, however, the victorious Crusaders, and the Orcs themselves, had long memories. The Knights of Ozem and the Nation of Lastwall became immediately hostile to Belkzen after the war ended, and the Orcs of Belkzen responded in kind. Raids into Lastwall, either for their own sake or in the service of Tar-Baphon, became the norm in Belkzen culture. As far as we know, only recently did groups of Orcs stand up against this practice. The Orcs of Belkzen also regularly raid the Shoanti, their human neighbors to the west, who live on the Storval Plateau. The Shoanti are a large ethnic group of humans, descended from the laboring underclass of humans in the Thessalonian Empire. Broken into several tribal groups called Quas, they have some interesting narrative and cultural parallels to Native Americans. The Shoanti have a mutually hostile relationship with the Orcs of Belkzen, with each side actively hating the other. The Orcs were likely the initial aggressors during the Age of Darkness, but, as mentioned, they were in an extraordinarily difficult material position. Either way, each side of the conflict is equally hostile to this day. Of the major Shoanti Quas, the Sklar Qua and the Lyrun Qua are the tribal groups which have the most direct and constant conflict with the Orcs of Belkzen. More recently, in the 4040s, 4050s, and 4060s AR, the mercenary-turned-warlord Khazavon established his fortress at Castle Scarwall after cutting a vicious swath through Belkzen at the head of his Ustalavic armies. Khazavon, who was secretly a dragon in disguise, betrayed the leaders of Ustalav and attempted to establish a kingdom of his own. He sought to bring the Orcs of Belkzen under his thumb, much like Tar-Baphon before him. This plan came to an end when Khazavon was defeated. This was about 700 years ago in universe, at the time of Triumph of the Tusk. About 30 years ago, in 4692 AR, the leader of the Empty Handhold, Grask Uldith, seized control of Urgir, making him the most powerful Orc chieftain in the region, and the de facto leader of Belkzen as a whole. Over the next 10 years, Grask Uldith consolidated his power and began introducing reforms to Urgir and the surrounding lands. Grask was a phenomenal leader among his people, and quickly realized that wealth and prosperity for the Orcs lay not in a continuation of their traditional raiding customs, but in the embrace of a more trade-focused worldview. Belkzen is well positioned for north-south trade in Avestan, and establishing and securing these trade routes became Grask's #1 priority. This progressive and less outwardly warlike stance earned Grask much mockery among his people, but his uncontested strength and unmatched cunning eventually won out. Grask Uldith cared deeply for the fate of his people, and he applied his merciless worldview to the task of their advancement. He may have advocated for a more progressive culture in Belkzen, but he was more than willing to employ the traditional Orc values of hierarchy and violence to achieve it. He maintained a strong hatred for dwarves his entire life, and ruled Belkzen with an iron fist. Grask eventually died in 4716 AR at the hands of some unknown assassin. His second-in-command, Ardax the Whitehair, killed the assassin soon after, and ascended to power. Ardax, called the Whitehair due to having lived to middle age, was as cunning as his predecessor, but had an even more diplomatic approach to stepping onto the world stage. Of course, there's far more going on in Ardax's story with Grask Uldith, but I reserved that for a separate video on the Orc Pantheon, since those events aren't publicly known. That video will be coming out soon. Getting back to the history of Belkzen, most recently, in 4719, the Whispering Tyrant, Tar-Baphon, escaped his imprisonment within Gallowspire. Though thwarted in his attempt to conquer Absalom and achieve godhood, he quickly returned to his fortress on the Isle of Dread. In an attempt to reassert his ancient domain, the tyrant sent envoys to Orc leaders in Urgir and demanded their fealty and return to his service. Ardax, now the master of Urgir, refused these envoys out of hand, killing them immediately and mounting their heads on the walls of the city. Outraged, Tar-Baphon sent an army of undead warriors to bring the Orcs to heel, but this army was crushed at the Battle of the 9 Broken Skulls, where the outnumbered Orcs under Ardax rallied and slaughtered them. This victory went a long way towards cementing Ardax's rule over Belkzen, and he has used this political momentum to attempt to bring the Orcs of Belkzen to a new negotiating position on the world stage. Ardax's vision for the Orcs is of a unified people who seek to use trade and diplomacy in conjunction with their military might to ensure their own self-governance and self-determination from now on. The Orc Pantheon and the God's Reign. If you are considering playing an Orc or Dromar in this campaign, I would strongly suggest considering faith in one of the deities of the Orc Pantheon for your character. In the interest of not getting too far off topic in this video, however, I have broken off this section on the gods of the Orcs into its own video, which should drop sometime later this month. I strongly encourage you to check out that video to help flesh out your understanding of Orcish culture. Plus, hey, it helps out the channel. The Holds of Belkzen. In the modern Hold of Belkzen, the native Orcs are divided into multiple holds, large tribes which function like a combination of family groups, political organization, and gangs which control territory. Dozens of holds exist in Belkzen today, and they vary in size from a few dozen families to thousands of Orcs and Dromar. I'll start by describing the 8 holds which are the most relevant to this campaign, based upon their size, political power, and willingness to participate in the Torrent Moot. After I cover these 8, I will also briefly touch on an additional 15, which PCs coming to the Torrent Moot would likely have been briefed on prior to their arrival. Up first among the most relevant holds is the Bloodied Gauntlet hold. These orcs have historically been followers of Gorum, the Lord in Iron, god of battle, weapons, and armor. The Bloodied Gauntlet orcs traditionally operated in southern Belkzen, where they could pursue continuous combat with their neighbors to the east in Lastwall. While mighty and feared, the Bloodied Gauntlet orcs also developed a sense of honor based on Gorum's teachings. They were warriors and raiders, but refused to kill non-combatants. However, all of this information is in flux since the God's Reign incident, when a Chekek, god of assassins, murdered Gorum. With their patron deity dead and gone, the Bloodied Gauntlet orcs are in desperate need of direction and leadership. In the coming years, they will need to find a new sense of identity. Up next, the Burning Sun hold was formed in recent decades by the legendary warrior Maja Firehair. Firehair declared herself a rage priest of Sarenrae, and she took it upon herself to collect the many orcs who had become outcasts from Belkzen's other holds. She introduced the teachings of Sarenrae to these followers, leading to them embracing a more benevolent but not entirely peaceful worldview than many of the neighboring orcs. Recently, Maja Firehair ascended to divinity in the Orc Pantheon, becoming a goddess of fire and community. Though the Burning Sun orcs have lost their mortal leader, her guidance still directs and empowers them alongside the teachings of Sarenrae. The Death's Head hold is based in the lands around Urgir, though they don't control the city directly. The orcs of the Death's Head hold have recently pledged themselves to Ardax the Whitehair, and serve loyally as his soldiers and agents. These orcs defend the city of Urgir, Ardax's capital, both by standing atop the city's walls and by patrolling the territory surrounding the city. To the west, the orcs of the Drowning Sand hold make their way in the world as professional navigators and guides through the Dirt Sea. The Dirt Sea is a region of Belkzen consisting of large fields of quicksand, dotted with small islands of solid ground. The Drowning Sand orcs make their homes on these landlocked islands, and earn their living by ferrying goods and travelers across the sands, using catamarans of their own design and make. Back at Urgir, the Empty Hand hold is the hold of Ardax the Whitehair, overlord of Belkzen. The orcs of the Empty Hand hold encourage and protect trade with outsiders. Nearly all trade in the region flows through Urgir, allowing them to maintain a tight grip on the resources moving through the region. This has led to the Empty Hand hold becoming exceptionally wealthy and well-equipped. With their dominance in the areas of weapons, armor, and logistics, the Empty Hand hold has become exceptionally powerful. Far less powerful is the Gut Spear hold, a tribe which has recently been driven out of the fortress of Deepgate by the Eight Fingers hold. Now, limited to the caves of the Koror Mountains, many Gutspear orcs seek a means of securing new territory for themselves and advancing their standing in tribal politics. In the far north, the Icetooth hold resides along the border with the realm of the Mammoth Lords. The Icetooth orcs make their way in the world as hunters of megafauna, and by raiding and trading with their Kelid human neighbors. The Icetooth orcs are known to capture and train the infamous Warcats of Rull, powerful megafauna used as beasts of war and as mounts. Juka, the goddess of big game hunting and cooperation, holds a particular appeal to the Icetooth orcs. Finally, the Storm Screamers of Rull are an interesting hold. Dedicated to the storm god Rull, the Storm Screamers are devoted to the protection and observation of nature. They have a special affection for rain and storms, and are generally avoided by other holds, due to their odd ways. Storm Screamers tend to be druids and rangers, and survive as hunters, guides, and scouts in the mountains of eastern Belkzen. The Storm Screamers of Rull have a special connection to the herds of Aurochs which descend from the mountains during the Flood Truce. This is the hold which monitors the Aurochs populations and prevents overhunting, in addition to defending the herds from outside threats. Those are the 8 most relevant holds for players to consider when building their characters, but there are more than a dozen additional holds which I will now cover very briefly. The Black Sun hold is the hold of the Great Belkzen himself. Today, the hold functions as a mercenary force, offering its services out to other holds for a fee. The Blood Trail and Skull Eater holds are bitter enemies. Each of them controls one end of the Whisperfall Pass, and uses their position to impose tolls on travelers. The Broken Spine operates out of the Mindspin Mountains, where they regularly raid the Shoan-Ti. They were recently embarrassed at the hands of the famous Pathfinder agent Eando Klein. Two holds, the Deadeye in the Kodor Mountains and the Twisted Nail in the Mindspinned Mountains, are considered especially primitive and uncultured, even by other orcs. Both are noteworthy for embracing cannibalism. In the Kodor Mountains, the Deep Gate is currently controlled by the Eight Fingers Hold, who've controlled the fortress for more than 10 years. At the city of Blisterwall, two holds, the Haskodar and the One-Eye, are locked in a long-term contest for control. This contest started when the Haskodar orcs invaded the city more than 20 years ago. Two orc holds have a connection to necromancy, the Open Barrow Hold and the Skittering Ravager Hold. These holds are unpopular due to their magical practices, even more so now with the reemergence of Tar-Baphon. One hold, whose status is currently in flux in Belkzen, is the Defiled Corpse Hold, which was singularly dedicated to the orc god Zagresh. With Zagresh's death at the hands of Grask Uldeth, the fate of the Defiled Corpse orcs is very much an open question. The Steel Eater Hold, operating out of the fortress called the Foundry, is a tribe known for metalworking and weapons craft. They utilize their control of weapons production to ensure a strong political position. Finally, the Wing Ripper tribe occupies the territory around Wyvernsting, though they don't control the city. The Wing Ripper orcs are wyvern riders, hunting and taming young wyverns to make them into fearsome mounts. International interests. With the rise of Ardax the Whitehair and his increased emphasis on trade and negotiation, multiple international organizations have taken an interest in the political developments in Belkzen. All the organizations I'm about to discuss have an interest in attending the upcoming Torrent Moot and hearing out Ardax's proposal for an alliance. Two of these organizations are taking a distinctly academic interest in Belkzen: the Pathfinder Society and the Esoteric Order of the Palatine Eye. The Pathfinder Society is an organization of adventurers, scholars, and heroes who operate all across Golarion. Their goals are broad and diverse, but they generally seek to build friendships, explore new locations, and document cultural and historical information. Pathfinder field agents operate with a degree of independence, but often report back to the many lodges scattered around the planet. No lodge exists in Belkzen, though the PFS is certainly interested in making inroads into the region. In addition to their academic tendencies, the PFS is also opposed to the actions of Tar-Baphon. The Esoteric Order of the Palatine Eye is a secretive collection of scholars and philosophers dedicated to the discovery of ancient occult knowledge. The order was founded in Ustalav more than 700 years ago, and remains largely based in Ustalav to this day. Members of the order are experts on all things occult, eldritch, and mysterious, and they actively seek out new sources of magical knowledge to aid in their ever-growing understanding of the universe. In addition to being interested in the largely unexamined magical practices of the orcs, members of the order might be motivated to join the Torrent Moot by their fierce opposition to Tar-Baphon and the Whispering Way. Three other factions are taking an interest in Belkzen from a distinctly financial perspective. These are the Nation of Druma, the Aspis Consortium, and the Kelid tribes of the Realm of the Mammoth Lords. The Calistocracy of Druma is a nation on the southern shores of Lake Encarthen. The Prophecies of Calistrade, a pseudo-religious philosophy devoted to personal perfection and the accumulation of wealth, are functionally the state religion in Druma. The nation is built on robust systems of trade designed to facilitate the collection of wealth among the rich. While Druma's legendary mercenary military, called the Blackjackets, is well equipped to fight off Tar-Baphon, the citizenry has become concerned that the Lich's presence will permanently dampen trade on Lake Encarthen, resulting in decreased profits. Additionally, Belkzen presents a tempting location ripe for the development of new markets for consumer goods. The Aspis Consortium, meanwhile, is an international trade organization founded about 200 years ago in Cheliax. The goals of the Aspis Consortium are simple: make a profit by any means necessary. Agents of the Aspis Consortium will commit any number of crimes to accomplish their goal of making money, from stealing ancient artifacts, to murdering potential rivals, to even kicking off wars to ensure demand for their goods. In Belkzen, the Aspis Consortium sees a land full of mighty warriors, who might be employed as mercenaries or agents, and potential new trade routes ideal for resource extraction and the transportation of stolen goods. From the north, the Kelid humans of the realm of the Mammoth Lords see in Belkzen an opportunity for major economic development. A stable Belkzen would allow for greater access to the realm of the Mammoth Lords, which in turn allows for greater access to the Path of Agan-He, the only overland trade route to the Dragon Empires in Tian Sha. If overland trade across the Eye of the World were to increase, all that wealth would need to flow through the realm of the Mammoth Lords and Belkzen, making a trade agreement between the two regions an obvious win for both sides. Of course, the primary appeal of Ardax's proposed alliance with the Torrentmoot is military in nature. Tar-Baphon presents a rare opportunity for the peoples of Central Avestan to unify against a common enemy, and numerous nations are willing to at least consider the idea. The primary military interests at the Torrentmoot likely include Ustalav, the remains of Lastwall, the Five Kings Mountains, Kionin, and Oprak. Multhun and Nirmathas might be interested as well, but may be too engaged with fending off the threats of the Gravelands to commit to Ardax's request for negotiation. The peoples of Ustalav are, understandably, horrified at the return of Tar-Baphon. The Whispering Tyrant once ruled over their land with an iron fist, and the horrors of his reign are remembered still, even thousands of years later. With the destruction of Lastwall in the south, Ustalav finds itself bordered by the tyrant-controlled Gravelands. This, coupled with the presence of undead forces on the lake, puts Ustalav in desperate need of allies, and this desperation might be enough to cause the peoples of Ustalav to bury the hatchet with the Orcs who've threatened them for so long. Lastwall the nation is gone, destroyed by Tar-Baphon during his escape from the prison of Gallowspire. Still, the Knights of Lastwall remain, and are dedicated to the destruction of the tyrant and the restoration of the Gravelands. The Knights of Lastwall might be scattered across the nearby nations and distant Absalom, but they still operate as an organized movement. The Knights Vigilant faction might be motivated to ally with Belkzen to reinforce the defenses of the nations around Lake Carthen. The Knights Reclamant faction, meanwhile, might use this opportunity to recruit powerful Orcs and Dromar to their cause, especially those who harbor a burning hatred for Tar-Baphon. To the south, the dwarves of the Five Kings Mountains certainly recognize the threat posed by the tyrant. They've begun the construction of Torag's Shield, a magic-resistant fortification intended to deflect Tar-Baphon's own magic. At the same time, the dwarves have a complicated and heated history with the Orcs, made all the more complicated by the now-divine Grask Uldeth's recent attempt to assassinate Torag and the Orc god Uwirk's willingness to step in and save the Dwarven Patriarch. Even Ardax's capital, Urgir, is a former Dwarven sky citadel, which the Orcs captured in war. Despite all of this, the opportunity for improved relations between the Orcs and Dwarves is a compelling prospect. The Elves of Kionin have a less tense relationship with the Orcs, though there's little love lost between the two peoples. There isn't much in the way of common ground between Elven and Orcish culture. Kionin might be especially interested in this alliance based on their relative distance from Belkzen. Even if the Orcs prove untrustworthy, they present no immediate threat to the Elves. To the west, the recently established Hobgoblin nation of Oprak is much closer to Belkzen, both culturally and geographically. The Hobgoblins of Oprak partake in a heavily militaristic culture, with emphasis placed on discipline, strength, and hard work. This aligns nicely with many of the practices of the Orcs of Belkzen. The nation of Oprak would see an obvious benefit in a potential alliance with Belkzen, and would almost certainly send representatives to the Torrentmoot. Finally, the Shoanti of the Storval Plateau have a complicated history with the Orcs of Belkzen. Of the 7 Quas in Shoanti society, the Sklar Qua and the Lyrune Qua tribes have warred with the Orcs of Belkzen for millennia, with atrocities committed on both sides of the conflict. These two tribes might be interested in peace if they could be convinced to bury the hatchet. but the Skoan-Kawa tribe, which focuses on caring for the dead, might be more willing to at least listen to Ardax's proposal, in no small part because of the threat posed by Tar-Baphon. While not a national group, multiple mercenary companies exist all across Avestan, which might be interested in Ardax's proposals at the Torrent Moot. I already mentioned the famous Black Jackets of Druma, but dozens of other companies could see Belkzen as a rich recruitment opportunity. With the increasing military tensions in the Eye of Dread region, numerous mercenary companies could see a need to increase their strength and manpower. Campaign backgrounds. Alright, now it's time to dig into some player-facing information intended to help you build your characters for Triumph of the Tusk. Moving away from my normal order of operations, I'll be starting with campaign backgrounds. Why? Well, this campaign encourages PCs to think about what faction they might represent at the Torrent Moot, referred to as their patron. PCs will likely represent the international patrons which I just discussed, but might also be members of one of the major orc holds in Belkzen. As I go through each of the campaign-specific character backgrounds for Triumph of the Tusk, I will also highlight which patrons seem like the best fit for each background. Of course, bear in mind that this assessment is only my opinion and suggestion. If you have an idea to pair these backgrounds with other patrons, that could easily work. The Badlands Scout background represents characters who have experience in the harsh terrain of Belkzen and the surrounding area. These characters can survive in this terrain with more ease than most, and have experience in assessing the natural dangers of the region. Characters with this background gain proficiency in survival and Badlands lore, as well as the Forager skill feat. The Pathfinder Society has plenty of agents who operate in regions similar to Belkzen. Nearby nations like the Realm of the Mammoth Lords, Oprok, Ustalav, and the Shoanti tribes all train scouts and explorers in terrain similar to Belkzen, as do the various mercenary companies around the Eye of Dread. Of the orc holds of Belkzen, the Death's Head, Drowning Sand, Ice Tooth, and Storm Screamer holds all train substantial numbers of scouts and warriors who operate in Belkzen's harsh scrublands. The Belkzen Anthropologist background represents characters who have a fascination with the history of Belkzen and its people. This history exists now in fragments and incomplete collections scattered across the hold, with writings on the subject either having been destroyed over the years of war or never having been compiled in the first place. Characters with this background gain proficiency in Society and Orc Pantheon lore, in addition to the multilingual skill feat. Both the Pathfinder Society and the Esoteric Order of the Palatine Eye might have agents, especially Dromar agents, who desire to compile the stories of the Orcs of Belkzen. The same might be true of the orcs native to Belkzen, especially members of the Burning Sun, Death's Head, Empty Hand, and Gut Spear holds. The Empty Hand Loyalist background represents characters, especially orcs and Dromar, who wish to see the orcs of Belkzen abandon their traditionally violent ways and move toward a more diplomatic way espoused by Ardax the Whitehair. Characters with this background gain proficiency in Intimidation and Belkzen lore, in addition to the Quick Coercion skill feat. Both the Pathfinder Society and the Aspis Consortium could desire this political development, as it would open up the region to their broader goals. Similarly, Ustalav and Lastwall play host to numerous Dromar and have been subjected to orc raids for centuries, giving them plenty of motivation to push for Ardax's proposals. The Death's Head, Empty Hand, Gut Spear, and Bloodied Gauntlet holds are all likely to champion Ardax's ideals. The Foreign Diplomat background represents characters who are formal representatives of foreign nations and organizations. These characters are skilled in the art of diplomacy and seek to advance the goals of their countrymen and allies. Characters with this background gain proficiency in diplomacy and heraldry lore, in addition to the group impression skill feat. The Pathfinder Society and Esoteric Order of the Palatine Eye might send agents with training in diplomacy, as might both the Kelids of the Realm of the Mammoth Lords and the Merchant Lords of the Calistocracy of Druma. On top of that, each of the nations which I mentioned in my discussion earlier would almost certainly send diplomats: Ustalav, Lastwall, Kionin, the Five Kings Mountains, and Oprok, in addition to the Shoanti of the Storval Plateau. The self-made background is intentionally vague, representing characters who have worked extremely hard to earn their current position in the world. What that hard work was is up to you, as this background gives you the freedom to choose anything from manual labor to merchantry to formal apprenticeships. Characters with this background gain proficiency in athletics and a lore skill associated with the type of hard work they performed. They also gain the Hefty Holler skill feat. Any patron organization, both international and internal, could sponsor a character with this background. Finally, the trade representative background represents characters with a connection to a merchant organization in the region. These characters are most interested in the financial and mercantile aspects of Ardax's proposal. Characters with this background gain proficiency in crafting and mercantile lore, in addition to the quick repair skill feat. The Aspis Consortium, Calistocracy of Druma, and the tribes of the Realm of the Mammoth Lords could all send representatives which fit this background. The same could be said of the mercenary companies in the region, though their focus would likely be on the military industry specifically. Within Belkzen, the Death's Head, Empty Hand, and Drowning Sandholds all have a particular interest in trade and merchantry, and therefore might send representatives from this background. Before I close out this section, I should mention that Triumph of the Tusk doesn't do much to encourage the PCs to form a party, even if they come from diverse backgrounds or opposed patron organizations. For this reason, I strongly suggest addressing this concern during Session 0. If you want to play characters with conflicting interests, you'll want to make sure that they are not so diametrically opposed that they cannot work together, despite not having much in the way of personal history. Ancestries for player characters. The PCs of Triumph of the Tusk are expected to play the roles of dignitaries invited to the Torrent Moot to represent various interests in and around the Hold of Belkzen. Thankfully, this still provides a wide variety of ancestries for players to choose from. Naturally, Orcs and Dromar are the best thematic choice for a campaign focused on examining the evolving lives of the Orcs in the Age of Lost Omens. This does present a slight challenge, however, as the campaign as written assumes the PCs are representing interests outside of Belkzen's borders. That said, plenty of Dromar and even a few Orcs have left their homeland and sought employment or adventure abroad. Additionally, Orc raiding culture has resulted in plenty of Dromar having been born to the citizens of neighboring lands. These characters might be chosen as representatives to the Torrent Moot due to their ancestral connection to Belkzen, leaving plenty of thematic connections to use to add depth to your character. Outside of the Orcs and Dromar, the nations around Belkzen are populated by a large number of ancestries, the most common among them being humans. Humans are the most common ancestry in neighboring Ustalav, Druma, and Nirmathas. They were also the primary ancestry in Lastwall when that nation existed, and are heavily represented among the remaining Knights of Lastwall. These are the humans who are most likely to consider an alliance with the Orcs of Belkzen to face the rising threat of the Whispering Tyrant. Additionally, to the north, the Kelid humans of the Realm of the Mammoth Lords might be motivated to push for more stability in Belkzen to ensure more stable trade networks in the region. The Shoanti humans of the Storval Plateau also have a complicated history with the Orcs of Belkzen. The Sklarqua and the Lyrunqua tribes have the most contact with the Orcs of Belkzen, but the Skoanqua tribe, which focuses on caring for the dead, might be an even better thematic choice, since the Skoanqua would be the most strongly opposed to Undeath and the Whispering Tyrant. All that being said, if you plan on playing a Shoanti, I suggest talking to your GM, since they might need to adjust some events on the AP based on your selection. Beyond humans, the dwarves of the Five Kings Mountains might be an especially thematic pick for this campaign. Though the dwarves of Avestan have historically been the enemies of the orcs, they have recently experienced a reckoning with their past, due to the newly revealed truths about the quest for Sky. Many dwarves working through these revelations might feel compelled to reach out to Ardax's request for diplomats. At the same time, the recently ascended orc god Grask Uldeth attempted to assassinate Torag, the patron deity of the dwarves. This attempt might have succeeded were it not for the intervention of Uirk, another recently ascended orc deity. Needless to say, plenty of tension still exists between the orcs and the dwarves. The elves of Kyonen have a less thematic connection to the orcs, but are no less interested in a potential alliance. With their homeland adjacent to Lake Encarthen, the Sovirian elves are extremely vulnerable to an attack by Tar-Baphon. Though they have no vested interest in the orcs themselves, any potential ally is worthy of interest. The hobgoblins of Oprok, meanwhile, have a strong interest in the orcs of Belkzen. Both the orcs and the hobgoblins possess a highly militaristic culture, though they go about their militarism in distinctly different ways. The hobgoblins might see kindred spirits among the orcs, with their cultural emphasis on military might, and plenty of hobgoblins might see potential in an alliance with the orcs against Tar-Baphon. Lastly, plenty of Isoki, or ratfolk, make their living in the territories around Belkzen. The Isoki in the Eye of Dread region commonly make their way as traveling merchants, and might have some associations with the prophecies of Calistrade in Druma. Historically, the Isoki have learned to avoid Belkzen as a region filled with bandits, but they might be drawn to the new business opportunities and trade routes presented by a stable Belkzen. Beyond these ancestries, which are prominent in the regions surrounding Belkzen, there are several other ancestries which might be especially thematic for a campaign set in the Orc Hold. Both the Kolo and the Iruxi of Avestan exist in relatively small numbers, but both peoples have strong cultural parallels to the Orcs of Belkzen. Kolo and Iruxi place substantial cultural importance on strength, survival, and reverence of one sort or another for one's ancestors. All these points could allow for some connection between these ancestries and the Orcs. Kolo and Iruxi communities could thrive in Belkzen, so members of these ancestries might attend the Torrent Moot seeking a new home for their peoples. Goblins might find themselves in a similar position, despite the obvious physical differences which separate them from the Orcs. Goblins, like Orcs, are commonly persecuted throughout much of Avestan. As such, the dangers of Belkzen might not seem so scary to the goblins, who already live in fear of the Longshanks wherever they go. The Orcs, meanwhile, might find the goblins particularly useful for their inventive tendencies and their proclivity for fire. Especially under the rule of Ardax, Belkzen might prove an unlikely sanctuary for goblin kind. Classes for player characters. Moving on to looking at classes for PCs, it's important to remember that Strength and Wisdom are the two most valued ability scores in Orc culture, though Charisma also has its place. With that in mind, let's begin by looking at the high-damage martial classes. A wide variety of martials can succeed in this campaign, especially with proper skill investment, but my number one suggestion is definitely the Ranger. The high damage potential the Ranger provides, alongside the class's natural inclination towards the nature and survival skills, makes it an obvious choice. Any Ranger subclass could perform well in this campaign, even the Vindicator class archetype. Outside of the Ranger, the Fighter and Exemplar could both perform well in this campaign, and the Exemplar could connect nicely with the lingering influence of the recent changes to the Orc Pantheon. Barbarians are, of course, great choices for a campaign in Belkzen, though I suggest considering the Spirit Instinct as a means of connecting with the threatening presence of undeath throughout the campaign. Orc monks tend to favor stances which rely on strength, and dex-based stances would be considered odd. The champion might perform well in this campaign, though I suggest taking a close look at the deity discussion later in this video. I am recording this video prior to the release of Battlecry, so I haven't seen the final versions of the Commander or Guardian classes as of the making of this video. I suspect that both of them would also be good fits for this campaign, though, based on the playtest. For archetypes, which might add a little combat-focused flavor to your character, anything from the 2-weapon warrior, to the sentinel, to the mauler, to the bastion could work great. You might also consider the undead slayer. Looking at the skill monkey classes, a few stand out in this campaign, since the number of non-combat challenges is surprisingly high. The rogue, as the obvious master of skills, will excel here, though the ruffian and thief rackets are probably the best choices. The Avenger rogue could also work very well as long as you choose a thematically appropriate deity. More on those later. Thaumaturges could work well here too, with the weapon implement having the strongest connection to orc culture, and the regalia implement having the strongest connection to the themes of diplomacy and negotiation. Bards in this campaign will fit well, especially with the tradition of tale-telling among the orcs. The polymath and enigma muses will serve effectively in the various challenges the PCs will face, though the warrior muse will connect very well to orcish tradition. Looking at archetypes, the scout can be incredibly successful in this campaign, with scouting lore being an especially important lore skill. This AP also presents the brand new Tattooed Historian, which does a great job of bringing the concept of magical tattoos to life in the world, while rooting it nicely in orcish culture and giving them some fun combat abilities. Beyond these two archetypes, the Horizon Walker can bring a degree of useful terrain mastery to any party, while the Herbalist and Medic can help fill out the healing needs of the party outside of combat. For players considering casters, the big thing to remember about Belkzen culture is the lack of formal training facilities outside of religious temples. As such, wizards and maguses are fairly uncommon in the region. Animists and witches both fit this campaign well, playing on the theme of connecting to mysterious or powerful spirits. The Witness to Ancient Battles is probably the most thematic spirit for the Animist, while the Faith's Flamekeeper, Wilding Steward, and Choir Politic patrons are probably the best patron picks for witches. Clerics will perform especially well in the opening chapters of this campaign, and there are plenty of thematic deities to choose from. Similarly, druids will be especially effective at the wilderness navigation aspect of the story. No one druidic order is particularly thematic or antithetical to this campaign, so go nuts with that one. If you're willing to take on the mechanical complexity of the Oracle, the Battle and Ancestors mysteries could both be particularly thematic. The Life mystery could also work, less from a thematic standpoint and more from a mechanical one. Among the spellcasting archetypes, the Hallowed Necromancer is easily the best choice. Undead are fairly common in this campaign, so the ability to destroy them will be pretty handy. Thematic Faiths. Looking at the deities which might apply to this campaign, they can be broadly broken down into two groups. Deities which belong to the Orc Pantheon, and are therefore a good choice for natives to Belkzen, and deities which do not, and are therefore a good pick for visitors and foreign diplomats. Starting things off with the Orc Pantheon, PCs have a few fantastic deities to choose from. Uirk, the Bulwark, god of leadership and protection, is a phenomenal choice for orcs and Dromar. His teachings surrounding the protection of the weak and the opposition to tyranny will encourage heroic behavior and cooperation, an attitude which will work well in Ardax's Belkzen. Similarly, Maja Firehair, the Matron of Rights, goddess of community and fire, is another great option. Her edicts encourage community building and the raising up of orc society as a whole, which, again, align with the goal of Ardax and the themes of the campaign. Juka, the Relentless Huntress, goddess of communal hunts and feasts, is another community and cooperation-focused deity. She also brings a focus on the natural world to the table, which can work well throughout the AP. Finally, Wulgrin, the Bonebreaker, god of firearms and invention, is strongly opposed to Undeath and Tar-Baphon in specific, making him a great choice for a more innovative character. Of the remaining orc gods, only Grask Uldith could potentially work for a PC, but I would caution against it unless you are in an all-orc or Dromar party, or unless you are actively seeking to roleplay ancestral tensions. This could potentially be interesting, and even fun, but I wouldn't recommend playing one of his followers unless you are willing to embrace challenging roleplay, especially if you have a dwarf in the party. The other orc deities, Nolgrith, Rull, and Varg, are probably a bit too violent and unpredictable to be useful to PCs, unless you and your GM are willing to take the campaign in a more chaotic direction. Moving on to deities which are more applicable to visitors to Belkzen, these generally break down by national or political affiliation. For characters from Lastwall, for instance, Pharasma might be a great pick, due to her opposition to Undeath and Tar-Baphon. The same can be said of Sarenrae, though her added emphasis on mercy and redemption might make her followers even better suited to deal with the Orcs of Belkzen. Sarenrae also has a strong connection to Maja Firehair, and her faith might be surprisingly welcomed in some parts of Belkzen. Followers of Iomedae and Felena are extremely common among the Knights of Lastwall, and might be willing to work with the Orcs in the name of forming a unified front against Tar-Baphon. And even Erasni's followers might be willing to ally with the Orcs, for no other reason than to spite the Whispering Tyrant. If you're playing a dwarf from the Five Kings Mountains, the god Magrim would be an excellent choice, due to his opposition to Undeath. I would normally suggest Grundenar as another excellent choice, but recent developments from the God's Reign and the War of Immortals event have rendered him inactive in the universe. Check out a future video from me detailing that subject to find out more. Elves from Kyonin might be followers of any of the elven deities, though Desnans might be the most excited to travel to Belkzen. Characters from Druma, who focus on merchantry, might worship Abadar, but most likely adhere to the prophecies of Calistrade. If you're considering playing goblins, hobgoblins, Iruxi, or Kolo, their ancestral deities, or non-deific faiths, shouldn't present a serious problem. Much like the orcs, goblins have a unique method of creating new gods, in the form of their goblin hero gods, and followers of Teki Stronggut or Zugero might do well in Belkzen. Hobgoblins have relatively few gods who are actively worshipped, but Genzeri, goddess of tactics and negotiations, would be a great choice. Iruxi, or lizard folk, tend to worship nature spirits, which will work well in Book 2 of this campaign, while Kolo, or Gnolls, might gravitate toward ancestor worship, which is also thematically appropriate. My party. So this is something new for these Player's Guide videos. To close out this discussion on character creation, I want to discuss a sample party of 5 characters which I would produce for this AP. These characters will lean into my own personal tastes and my strong desire for thematic connection to the material and interpersonal interaction. This is as much a mental exercise for me as it is a tool for inspiration for you, the audience. Let me know what you think of this idea in the comments. This party consists of 5 characters: an orc from Belkzen, a Dromar from Belkzen, a Dromar from outside of Belkzen, a human from the Storval Plateau, and a dwarf from the Five Kings Mountains. Up first is Morgadth, an orc from the frozen north of Belkzen. A member of the Icetooth Hold, Morgadth is a pragmatic hunter who has a strong faith in Juka the Big Game Hunter. She's a precision edge ranger who uses a composite longbow in combat, though she keeps a short sword on hand for when melee combat is unavoidable. The Icetooth Hold acts as her patron in this campaign, and she has the Badlands Scout background. In a free archetype campaign, I would consider the Scout or Herbalist archetypes to round out the party's needs. Next, Urgask is a Dromar who grew up in and around Urgir. As a member of the Empty Hand Hold, Urgask is loyal to Ardax and his unification project. A devout follower of Uirk, Urgask sees the advancement of Orcish culture as a project involving diplomacy, cooperation, and forgiveness. As a mastermind rogue, he favors the Star Knife in combat, a weapon which was stolen by Orc raiders from the Skalar Qua of the Storval Plateau. The Empty Hand Hold is his patron, and he has the Empty Hand Loyalist background. In a free archetype campaign, I would consider the Scout or Medic archetypes. Bolkekt, or Bolk to his friends, is a Dromar who was born outside of Belkzen. Having joined the PFS at a young age, Bolk was a natural choice as an agent in Belkzen, and he has since embraced his role by becoming an expert in local customs and negotiation. Bolk is a polymath bard who leans hard into diplomacy and intimidation to augment his spellcasting. The PFS acts as his patron in this campaign, and he has the Belkzen anthropologist background. In a free archetype campaign, I would suggest the tattooed historian archetype for this character. Up next, Taktalan, or Wisp Watcher, is a middle-aged shaman from the Skoan-Kwa tribe of the Shoanti on the southern Storval Plateau. She is a protector of the dead among her people, and her opposition to undeath motivated her to attend Ardax's Torrent Moot. An animist, Wisp Watcher relies on her spells in combat. Her patron in this campaign is the Skoan-Kwa tribe, and she has the foreign diplomat background. In a free archetype campaign, I would lean into the Hallowed Necromancer archetype. Finally, Grud, of the Iron Fist clan, is a dwarf from the Five Kings Mountains. As a member of the Rivethun, Grud is a wise spiritualist, and is adept at understanding the perspectives of others. In addition to the traditional Rivethun spirits, Grud holds the teachings of Grundenar, dwarven god of alliances, in high regard. Grud is a monk, and uses Mountain Stance and various key spells in combat. His patron is the Five Kings Mountains government, and he has the self-made background. In a free archetype campaign, I would consider the various Rivethun-associated archetypes from Divine Mysteries. As a party, these 5 characters managed to come together to push Ardax's unification program forward. Grud and Wispwatcher are most concerned with the spiritual destabilization which Tar-Baphon's influence implies. By contrast, Urgask and Morgath are more immediate in their concerns, worried that the internal divisions among the Orcs will leave them weak to outside invasion. Bolk, meanwhile, acts as the unifier in the group, ensuring that they remain on task and focused. GM Suggestions, or How Would I Run This? Warning: the following section is intended for GMs only. If you are planning to play this adventure path, I suggest stopping this video now. I'll need to discuss some spoilers to properly address my suggested adjustments to the adventure. You have been warned. Okay, so Triumph of the Tusk has some pretty good and interesting ideas, but with a number of these ideas, the AP as a whole fails to stick the landing. The first and most obvious of these is the reliance, or some might say over-reliance, on victory points. Victory points can, and often do, serve as an effective means of tracking the party's progress in abstract or long-term challenges. In this AP, however, they feel a bit too prevalent, without being implemented in a nuanced or innovative way. As such, players might feel the systems become stale or repetitive. My suggestion is that these systems either be eliminated or expanded, depending on the specific implementation and the tastes of your party. In Book 1, for example, I would eliminate the infiltration points near the end of the book, but lean into the caravan points. The former feels weakly implemented and easy to ignore, while the latter feels a little better thought out and more exciting, making it easier to expand upon. Similarly, I might expand upon the social influence which the players engage in with Ardax and his advisors in Book 2. This system has a really good idea in the way it impacts the challenges the players will face later in the book. I would make these impacts more obvious, since the players will want to feel the impact of their decisions. At the same time, I think the influence could be expanded even further, with more challenges, interactions, and decisions for the PCs to influence. To give these added decisions narrative weight, I would add more travel encounters which change and evolve based on the decisions the players made. The next thing I would change is the patron system, described in the Player's Guide and in Book 1. To be clear, I like the patron system. The idea that the PCs are representatives of larger organizations is a great idea that gives the sense of weight to their actions and a sense of identity to the campaign as a whole. As written, the system falls off after the first book, which is a huge missed opportunity for me. I would expand the patron system into books 2 and 3 by allowing the patrons which the PCs represent to provide aid to Ardax and his cause. After Book 1, the PCs should be allowed to pass messages, either physically or via magic, back to their patron organization. Then, later, they could receive a message back from the organization, informing them of resources, support, or troops to which they have access, and which they can deploy to aid Ardax. This might seem complicated, since there are dozens of potential patrons, but really, you would only have to think up 4 or so solutions, since that's the number of players in the party. This is probably best illustrated using an example. If one of the PCs is a member of the Knights of Lastwall, the Knights could dispatch a small contingent of Shining Sentinels to Belkzen, the faction which is known for its diplomatic and defensive prowess. These Sentinels could serve as a security force in Belkzen, which the PCs could choose to deploy to secure roadways, defend settlements, or even aid in the assault on Blisterwall. If the Sentinels are deployed to defend roadways, for example, the PCs could skip a random encounter, and witness the Knights cleaning up from a battle as they travel past. As another example, if one of the PCs was from either the Skoan Kawa or the Esoteric Order of the Palatine Eye, perhaps the aid arrives in the form of necromantic scholars or sages, who can provide expertise in counteracting the death magics affecting the region. These experts could provide additional information on combating the ancestor storms, or could even weaken undead enemies which the PCs need to face. These interventions don't need to be particularly extensive to feel meaningful. Even one small social interaction, one decision regarding deployment, and one impact on the field could be enough to give the PCs a sense that their involvement has made a substantial difference. Finally, the most important narrative change I would make is to Ardax himself. Ardax is the central NPC around whom the entire campaign should turn. But in the campaign as written, he lacks a distinct personality, and doesn't have much in the way of characterization. Ardax in the lore is fascinating. He served as the right hand of Grask Uldeth, the platonic ideal of an orc warlord, for years, before assassinating his master and seizing power. Despite this, he isn't in poor standing with the Orcs of Belkzen, or indeed with Grask himself after the warlord ascended to divinity. Ardax is instead seen as a hero, a unifying force in opposition to Tar-Baphon's aggression. He rules through guile, cunning, and negotiation, a style of rulership which flies in the face of racist orcish stereotypes. At the same time, he is an accomplished warrior, who is more than able to stand on his own in a fight. Unfortunately, very little of this is conveyed in the AP. Ardax doesn't feel distinctly orcish, and instead comes across as generally, but not especially, competent. I would fix this by adding more interactions with Ardax in the first chapter. I like the idea of him actively seeking to unify the Torrent Moot attendees by being sociable and welcoming. I would add scenes which show him participating in the various challenges in which the PCs can take part. In these events, Ardax should excel, but doesn't need to be the best. He doesn't need to be a Superman to be an effective leader, and clever PCs might even notice him throwing a match or two to win the loyalty of others. As the moot comes to an end, I would add at least one combat encounter which demonstrates, without question, Ardax's combat prowess. He should seem absolutely dominant in a fight, but his fighting style shouldn't be brutish or savage. A barbaric display of rage might be expected, but I think it's more important to show him as calculating, controlled, and brutally efficient and effective, willing to use terror and his environment to win a fight. When Ardax separates himself from the group at the end of Book 1, I suggest emphasizing how vulnerable he leaves himself to ensure the success of the PCs and the other warnings which must be passed through Belkzen. He shouldn't seem brave to the point of stupidity, but should be willing to take a risk, confident that his own strength will win the day. This could be emphasized when the PCs meet him again in Book 2. I would have him appear no worse for wear in Urgir, but the PCs could encounter rumors that he and his guards overcame substantial odds to succeed in their mission. The political interactions in Book 2 provide further opportunities to show Ardax's cunning, ruthlessness, and leadership. I suggest adding interactions with priests of the various religions popular in Belkzen, demonstrating a skill in understanding Orc culture and his good standing with major faiths. I would also add interactions, direct or indirect, which demonstrate Ardax's obvious care and concern for his people. He's willing and able to do difficult and even terrible things to protect his people, but his fundamental goodness shouldn't be in doubt. The trick here will be to make Ardax a friend to the PCs, someone they support and want to succeed. At the same time, he can't become a GM PC, or the main character. This is ultimately the PC's story, and Ardax should never overshadow their accomplishments. One tool which might ease this tension could be to have Ardax regularly reward the PCs with interesting items, artifacts, or titles and responsibilities. As an example of this, though one at much higher level, take a look at the interactions between Queen Tilandia Adasaril and the heroes of the Spore War adventure path. Post-campaign suggestions. Shifting gears a bit, since this campaign ends with the PCs at level 12, there's plenty of opportunity for some post-campaign fun if you want to do some homebrew. One adventure idea I might suggest is a potential dungeon crawl through the ruins of Castle Scarwall. This fortress was once the seat of power for the mighty warlord Khazavon, who enslaved the Orcs of Belkzen long ago. Castle Scarwall was explored in depth as part of the Curse of the Crimson Throne adventure path back in the early days of Pathfinder, before the Pathfinder rules system was even finalized. Castle Scarwall is an awesome dungeon, which butts up against one of the legendary Star Towers of Dobral. Haunted by powerful undead spirits, the castle is infested with traps, haunts, and powerful monsters. Though Khazavon himself is long dead, many artifacts exist which might bring him back to life. Called the Relics of Khazavon, these items are scattered all across the Inner Sea region, and are detailed in the 1E sourcebook, Artifacts and Legends. If someone were to gather one of these relics, then return it to Castle Scarwall in an attempt to restore Khazavon to his full power, that might present an existential threat to the Orcs of Belkzen. Such a disaster would trap the Orcs in a two-front war, with Tar-Baphon in the east and Khazavon in the west. Well, if you still want to play Triumph of the Tusk, then this video should have provided you with enough information to get started. If you and your group decide this AP is for you, then I strongly suggest that each player read the official Player's Guide from Paizo. The GM should read that as well, but should also look at the Lost Omens World Guide and Legends sourcebooks to flesh out their understanding of Belkzen and Ardax the Whitehair. The one ebook, Belkzen Hold of the Orc Hordes, could be useful as well, but is a little out of date, so not at all required reading. I'm really liking what Paizo has been doing with these ancestry-themed APs. Sky King's Tomb told an interesting dwarven story, and Triumph of the Tusk has done the same for the Orcs. I'm looking forward to finishing my video on Spore War to see how it continues in this tradition, so keep your eyes peeled for that one in the future. Also coming up in my workflow is the promised video on the Orc Pantheon, detailing the mortal orcs who've ascended to divinity and the method by which they've done so, the dangerous and infamous Crucible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.